I'm Madeline Ross, and it's Tuesday, April 27th, and it's morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. I know we are joined by a number of people in different places and continents today, but this virtual event is coming to you live from California, where our speaker is located, and from Washington, D.C., where I am. Our talk today is with James Greene. It's a pleasure for me to introduce him. And I'd like to begin by saying that he is an alumni of our very own China Studies program here at SAIS a number of years back. I'll say a few words about James and then the talk. He's held a number of high-profile and interesting positions related to China, both in the government and in the private sector. So I'll mention a few of those. From 2006 to 2010, he was on the policy planning staff of the State Department here in Washington, and then went to the private sector and became senior vice president at the Albright Stonebridge Group. He went back into the government in 2013 and then worked for both the Obama and Trump administrations in Beijing as the Minister Counselor for Trade Affairs. He is now working as a senior advisor to McClarty Associates, and he is also a senior research fellow at Georgetown University here in Washington. At Georgetown, he's put his government background to good use as the host and creator of a podcast called the U.S.-China Dialogue podcast series. In that series, which is available on the web, he is talking to a number of senior officials about their time in China or making policy related to China. He speaks with a number of former ambassadors. He speaks with Madeleine Albright, Robert Zoellick, and a number of other names familiar to the China community. And his talk today is going to draw on that experience and some of the lessons they have shared about handling crises in China relationships, as well as his own experience, and I think relate it to the very strange and difficult times that we find ourselves in now as far as our relationship with China. So I know we are all looking forward to hearing that, but let me also make a housekeeping note. We have a lot of participants, and we are going to ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A function here. So all questions will be written, and after the talk, I will moderate and select questions for Mr. Greene. So without further ado, James, good morning.
Good morning, Madeline. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, good evening, Washanghao, and Bon Pomeriggio for our friends at the Bologna Center and in Nanjing. Wonderful to be back with colleagues from SAIS. Yes, I did graduate way back in the Pleistocene era, it seems like, of China studies. As Madeline said, I have been at Georgetown for the last year and change, interviewing a number of former US government officials, and I'm using that to try to take stock of what we've learned over the last 40 years of diplomacy with the People's Republic. 1979, January 1st, is when the United States and China began diplomatic relations. And I talked to people who span that entire period. I'll get a little bit more into the methodology. Maybe I could just add a note or two about my own background. As Madeline said, I spent the last 5 years in the US Embassy working on trade. I had the privilege of going to the Ministry of Commerce to tell them we were going to put tariffs on their exports as part of the Section 301 investigation. And earlier in my time, I worked at the White House when Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao came as president and vice president. And so some of my remarks today reflect my own personal experience of sitting across the negotiating table from Chinese counterparts. And some of it reflects the experience of people who spent their entire career dealing with China. Other ones, they kind of come in and out, but they've either touched at a very high level or at a very working level. I'll get a little bit more into the methodology about who I talked to and how I decided that this was a good approach. Let me just go through the kind of 4 steps that I hope to cover today before opening up to questions. First, what are these lessons? Second, how did I conduct these interviews, and why did I select certain people? Third, is the past a guide? That is what worked in the 1970s and 80s, is that relevant for where the United States and China are today? And finally, some closing thoughts on what I think lies ahead. My central thesis is through diplomacy and government-to-government interaction, the US can achieve a fair amount of important objectives that improve the welfare, prosperity, and security for the American people. I would say at the outset, this goes against the grain of where I think most China watchers and most foreign policy experts are today. I think there's talk in Washington of decoupling of the US and Chinese economies and positions in the world. And the idea that you could talk to another power to solve problems is not particularly in vogue, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this project. More on that later. I think there's no doubt increased assertiveness on the part of the Chinese government and the foreign ministry. The Chinese phrase, 韬光养晦, 有所作为, is no longer used as a way of defining where Chinese foreign policy is. That is, to hide capabilities and bide your time. Clearly, we're seeing a much more assertive China. Just as one note of background before getting to the lessons and moving forward, there is a number of articles that have come out in about the last 18 months about America's China policy. And some of them are, did America get China's policy wrong? America's failed China strategy. And in this assessment, there seems to be a logic that the United States officials either ignored what was happening in China and China's rise globally and didn't prepare, or that we were not sufficiently robust enough in confronting China's authoritarian one-party state in global institutions and diplomatically, and therefore the US has somehow lost China. For those of you who are students of history, you'll recognize this term of art that was used in the 1950s, in which the State Department specifically was accused of quote unquote losing China after Mao Zedong came to power and the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek had to flee to Taiwan. So this is now wrapped up in our presidential debate, as both candidates are accusing the other of either being soft or will be soft on China in the next election. And again, we can get to more of that as we move forward. So what were the lessons that I gained from talking to these, as Madeline said, 20 plus US officials in how to deal with China? And what I tried to do in these conversations, and again, thank you for mentioning the podcast, which is available both on the Georgetown website as well as on Apple Podcasts. I tried to look at pivot events in US-China relations. So in the 1980s, it was confronting the Soviet Union, and the United States and China had a fair number of military-to-military interactions to address that aspect. In the 1989 Tiananmen Crackdown, there was a fair amount of fracture between US-China relations, and so I talked to officials about how they were dealing with that. In 1995, 96, there was a Taiwan Strait crisis in which the People's Liberation Army launched a number of missiles into the Taiwan Strait, and the US sent aircraft carriers into the region as a show of force. In the late 90s, early 2000s, China joined the World Trade Organization. The United States, under NATO, mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Our two planes collided over Hainan Island in 2001. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just kind of illustrative of the points of friction, of crisis in US-China relations, which I tried to use as a way to frame my discussions with former officials to ask, what did you do, senior official, to address this area of conflict? All the way up through the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and then the current trade conflict. So here's my list of 6 items of what works in the last 4 decades of diplomacy with the People's Republic of China and Chinese government officials. The first that I identify is to prioritize. I like to joke that Chinese leaders lead complex lives. I worked for Sandy Berger, former national security advisor, after he left the White House. This was in the early 2010s. And I said, Sandy, Chinese officials, they of course spend a lot of time thinking about the United States, but really for very senior officials, most of the time they spend thinking about managing their own country. And so for Chinese leaders to figure out what the top 1 or 2 issues are that the United States is asking is just critical to make progress on that issue. The U.S. has, if the U.S. has a long list of 36 goals, that really floods the zone for Chinese officials. They're not sure, is this important or is that important? I think for the Clinton and the Obama administrations, they were quite clear on what their objectives are in parts of their interaction with China. So for the Obama administration, climate change was clearly important. The DPRK was clearly important, and the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula was very important. For the George W. Bush administration, focusing on Iraq, Afghanistan, and DPRK, important. I think you could also say for all of those administrations, there were times when they didn't focus on the areas of priority, they focused on other issues. And that led to a confusing response on the Chinese side, in which Chinese officials legitimately said they weren't sure what US priorities were. So prioritize is a critical part to make progress in dealing with the Chinese system. The second is having leadership buy-in. Relations with the United States, as I alluded to before, for Chinese officials, just incredibly important. And I think that's been the way it's been true since Nixon's visit to China in 1972. And having that leadership buy-in to a negotiation or to an endpoint is going to put the possibility of success within reach. Just on my own, to use my own example, when I was the Minister Counselor for Trade at the embassy at the end of the Obama administration, we were pushing for a bilateral investment treaty between our 2 countries that would have opened up the Chinese investment market to a number of different sectors for US investors. Every single time our 2 presidents met, this is Obama and Xi Jinping, or Obama and Hu Jintao, we made sure that for the presidential statement that came out from the White House, there was some mention of making progress on the bilateral investment treaty. And what that did was, as a signal for the Chinese system and for our own system, that this was a priority. This was something that the leadership cared about. Now, of course, if you look at one of those communiques, you would see a list of 30 or 40 things. Now, obviously, not each of those is important, but without that leadership buy-in, you're just not going to get the push within the Chinese system or within our own system to make progress. Traditionally, the US has used the pomp and circumstance of a state visit to make progress on areas of substance of importance to the United States. I'll get to some other examples, but issues like non-proliferation, issues like cybersecurity, these were things that the US used a state visit on, or an official visit, to get real progress on. The most important part of that was then flipped on its head when in earlier this year in January, Liu He, the vice premier, came to Washington to sign the trade agreement with President Trump. And in fact, it was a reverse, in that the United States was seemingly more interested in the pomp and the signing ceremony, and the levels were extremely off. That is, a president is about 3 or 4 levels above a vice premier. And yet, because this administration focused so much on the pomp and the circumstance and the ceremony, they prioritized having a signing ceremony above protocol, and the Chinese side was left to say, yes, we will kind of accede to your need for protocol and put that in some ways over substance. The third area, excuse me for one moment. The third area that I've learned from talking to these former officials is to know your brief. US officials oftentimes face this asymmetry in that our officials often deal with many different countries. We're a global power, we have global interests, and Chinese officials really get to focus on, how am I going to deal with the United States? China has put also its top people on dealing with the United States. Our system has a mix of political people and career people, and that means a mix of interactions with Chinese officials. The former United States Trade Representative, Charlene Barshevsky, who was the lead in getting China into the WTO in the late 90s in the Clinton administration, the way she put it was, American officials need to bring their A game into negotiations. And interestingly, if you look at the Chinese Foreign Ministry, in about the 1990s, they prioritized having experience with the United States as a way to get promoted within their system. So Li Jiaoxing, who Secretary Albright talks about interacting with, was their ambassador to the United States, then ambassador to the UN, then ambassador to the United States, then a vice foreign minister, and then foreign minister. And in fact, if you look at a number of senior Chinese foreign ministry officials, they all have that career progression: ambassador to the United States, come back to Beijing, then become senior in their system. So what that means is, in the Chinese system, they know us extremely well. Li Jiaxing and Yang Jiechi, just to name two, they were either interpreters or longtime serving members in the Chinese foreign policy apparatus. Some of them, for Yang Jiechi's case, actually worked at the United States Embassy in Beijing in the 1980s. And so these are people who really know the United States well. I'm not blaming my fellow Americans for not speaking Chinese and not spending years studying China. But what I'm saying is there's an asymmetry. So US officials really have to know what's going on. Just one personal anecdote on Yang Jiechi, who has incredibly good English, is I was at a meeting, this was in 2002, it must have been, when I was at the State Department. And it was a senior US government official who will remain nameless at the moment, who was meeting with Yang Jiechi, who at the time was vice foreign minister. He had already been ambassador to the United States. And this US official brought up human rights. And this is a touchy subject in US-China relations, in which the Chinese government feels that the US is in no position to criticize China's human rights situation. And this senior US official said, well, I think any person would agree that the human rights situation in the United States is much better than that in China. And I will just say, it was a lunch. The rest of the lunch was completely wasted. That is, Yang Jiechi spent the subsequent 60 minutes explaining why that was not correct and why any US official who held that was not properly trained in the way that China actually works. Now, you can have those sorts of discussions. My only point is, bringing up human rights is perfectly acceptable thing for US government officials to do, but the time to do it and exactly how to do it requires experience of who your counterpart is, what are the issues, when are you going to bring it up. So in my opinion, the time to bring up that issue in this conversation would have been towards the end of the conversation. That is, get all your other points in line about what needs to happen in Afghanistan and in Iraq on other issues, and then towards the end, you bring up human rights because you know this is where the Chinese official is going to filibuster at the end of the conversation. Fourth, mixed public and private messaging. Since 2008 and the financial crisis, Chinese officials have become increasingly high-handed in how they deal with the United States. That said, the Chinese government and public opinion in China does matter, and how China sees itself is reflected in what the international press coverage is of China. And so Mike Froman, former United States Trade Representative, explained it to me this way. He said, look, use the candid conversations in private to probe where things can go, and then use public statements to try to push where you need things to end up. Susan Thornton, who was the Assistant Secretary of State during the Trump administration, talked to me in our discussion about how in 2015, in the Obama administration, before Xi Jinping came to Washington, the two sides were talking about cybersecurity. And there was a very strategic leak in the Washington Post of a story that the United States was going to be unhappy with this visit by Xi Jinping if cybersecurity was not addressed. Well, soon after that paper that was leaked to the press, the Chinese sent a very high-level delegation to the United States, and in the end, agreed to a new understanding that the two countries would not spy on each other using cyber methods for commercial gain. Again, there's questions as to whether or not that was an effective solution, but using the press was a way to get Chinese attention. Unfortunately, I think at the moment, both sides are really only using the press to communicate, and they're not using any sort of private messaging, and that is not going to be an effective way to address needs of either side. Fifth, finding the right negotiating partner. I'll just tell one kind of fun anecdote. If you have someone on the other side of the table who really wants to make progress, that makes a huge, huge difference. Winston Lord, former ambassador to China, very close aide to Henry Kissinger, he told this wonderful story of playing tennis with Premier Li Peng when he was ambassador, in which it was a mixed double, so men and women playing. Winston Lord brought his wife, and Li Peng brought a ringer in. He brought someone on the women's national tennis team of China. And so the four of them were playing tennis. And of course, Li Peng, as the premier, was not the counterpart to Winston Lord, but building up that sort of relationship, just incredibly important. Also signaling kind of a different time. It'd be hard to imagine, say, Li Keqiang, the current premier, playing tennis with Ambassador Branstad in Beijing, but stranger things have happened. Finally, the last point I just want to make is building coalitions inside and out. That is, within the Chinese system, there are different parts that want to interact with the United States in different ways. And it's a challenge of figuring out which parts of the system want to interact and how you can push things forward. And then also there's a regional context, that is how China is perceived in the region. And so Dave Scheer, who actually is a SAIS graduate, he retired from the Foreign Service and left government as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia. He was explaining to me, you need to have a strategy of dealing with friends and allies in the region and with China directly. That's the way that the Chinese government is going to see what the trend line is and where are things going. So let me speak very briefly on methodology and history and kind of see where we're going in the last 10 minutes we have. I undertook this project because my experience was, unlike people who saw things about failures in American China policy over the last 3 or 4 decades, my experience, having been inside the US government since the 1990s, was actually people working on US-China relations were very focused on what our goals and interests should be and how to try to achieve those in interacting with China. No one I dealt with when I was inside government thought talking to China or a dialogue with China was good for its own sake. Rather, my experience was people tried to use all elements of national power to interact with the Chinese government to advance US interests. One of the other reasons I did this was I thought this word, that talk, had become a 4-letter word in some ways. That dialogue itself, the act of dealing with another power, another country, was seen as somehow undermining US interests. And I just don't believe that's the case. My view is the US has global interests. We need to talk to a lot of different actors. That doesn't mean we agree with them all the time. That doesn't mean we're always going to find communion or common cause. But if we don't talk to them, we're not going to figure that out. And so I wanted to have a roadmap of how to interact with China over the last 40 years so that we know these sorts of things work, these sorts of things don't work. This is what happened in 1986. This is what didn't happen. Because our system, unlike the Chinese system, is one of short-term amnesia oftentimes. You know, our federal government is staffed with government career people that, in the Foreign Services case, they rotate every 2 or 3 years. For political appointees, they rotate every 4 years or even sooner. And so we don't have much of an institutional memory. And so I tried to capture some of that by talking to officials who were there. The last quote I'll just give is Winston Lord, as I said, former ambassador and longtime aide to Henry Kissinger, who said, you know, engagement, it's a mechanism, it's not a strategy. We don't talk to China, that's not the end goal. The end goal is to do something with China, and then talking and negotiating is part of that. So this brings up a very reasonable question in my view, which is history a guide? I first lived in China in 1992 in the now infamous city of Wuhan. And China's changed a lot since 1992. Is what we learned in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, is that relevant today? I'll just say my senior exam in China studies at SAIS in the 1990s, our professor, Professor Miller, asked us to write an essay on, was Mao Zedong's China more continuity or discontinuity from the Qing dynasty? That is, some parts of the communist administrative state that were set up were quite similar. There was an examination. The Gaokao system was continued. And there was naming of ministries. And so there's this, for all historians, this question of, is there continuity or discontinuity? In that case, for Mao's China to the Qing dynasty, I think probably more discontinuity than continuity. In this case, US-China relations in 2020, I think there's probably more continuity than discontinuity. As I said, there is more assertiveness on the part of the PRC. There is also more withdrawal in terms of US global positioning and where it's standing and its interaction with the global system under this administration. But I think broadly speaking, the officials are still in place largely in both sides. The foreign policy elite is still around in Washington and certainly in the Chinese context. And so I think what happened over the last 40 years can still serve as a guide, but maybe we can get to that in the question and answer part of, you know, is what happened in the past useful or not as a guide going forward? With that, I guess I would just do a check-in in the last 5 minutes we have here. You know, how are we doing on my 6 areas of how to interact with China? I would say probably pretty poor. I think if you look at both the US and China, there is on the one hand, for example, for my first area of prioritizing, I think you could say the Trump administration has really prioritized trade in dealing with China, and that's come to the top of the list, and that's been clear. But there's also been these other pushes on dealing with North Korea, on efforts of decoupling our two economies, particularly in the technology space. And I think for the Beijing side, there's been an emphasis on, oh, we need to talk to the United States, but really not much substance behind it. So I think on the priority part, we're kind of falling short. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the mix of public and private messaging, way too much public, not enough private. On the finding the right negotiating partner, I think the Chinese side would argue for the trade negotiations, they went through a cycle of different US officials, from Secretary Ross, Secretary Mnuchin, Larry Kudlow, to Ambassador Lighthizer, and there was in fact no right negotiating partner on their side. On the Chinese side, Liu He, the vice premier, has been consistently the person there. So I think it's been a mixed record on whether or not this administration and the Chinese government has followed my advice on what works and what doesn't in bilateral relations. Maybe I can use that as a jumping point for what lies ahead, and then we can get to the Q&A section. I guess as a kind of going in point, I would just say my experience has been countries interact not because they like you, but because they have shared goals and objectives. And I think that remains true today. I would say US security concerns about Chinese technology and technological growth, about Chinese military deployments, those will outlast the Trump administration. Whether or not President Trump leaves office in 2021 or 2025, whoever comes next will also have this challenge of how to deal with a rising superpower and what policies should be put in place. So the FBI is going to continue to investigate cyber attacks and investigate the Chinese government's activities in the United States. Congressional committees will continue to look at Chinese military deployments and what tools on economic sanctions should be put in place. I think US-China relations will become an organizing principle for many parts of the US government, and that's going to continue regardless of who's in the White House. And I think under Xi Jinping, China will continue to raise its international profile, in some ways exacerbate some of the ideological differences between the United States and China, arguing for a Chinese model of a one-party state and more tight controls over media and over society. And I think that is going to, those stress points are going to be manifest in international organizations and in relations in foreign policy. That said, under a different administration in Washington and potentially a different approach by some in Beijing, you could see an area of convergence on certain global issues, like how to deal with the global pandemic, for example, or how to deal with climate change, or how to deal with economic growth. And my hope is that going forward, we can use some of these things that we've learned from the past to plan US-China relations going forward for the future. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you, Madeline.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I really do appreciate the fact that you are bringing both your decades of experience and the insights to this discussion, because I feel very much reading the headlines every day that we are lacking perspective. It makes sense that we are engrossed in the issues of an unprecedented global pandemic, but when we deal with China, as you've noted, we are not relying on all these different channels of communication. We are finger pointing, and things are just at a state that seldom we've seen before. So I'd like to jump right into the present for the first question and use, let me step back 1 minute. I see we are getting questions, which is great. If you don't mind, I will identify the questioner unless you've asked to be anonymous. And I should start by identifying myself in case I didn't do that. I'm Madeline Ross, and I'm the Associate Director of the China Studies Program at SAIS. So James, could you say a little bit, I noticed you'd been writing about this in foreign policy, the current crisis, and the fact that we both both the US and China are medical research powerhouses, which I like that term, and yet we are not cooperating in any fashion and things are degenerating. Could you say a little bit about what your lessons might indicate for what we should do now?
Thank you for the question. I was reflecting, looking back on some old business cards from my time at the embassy in Beijing, and one of the cards I had was from the former HHS secretary, a person named Tom Price, who was a medical physician and member of Congress before becoming the Trump administration's first HHS secretary. He came to China in 2017, I want to say in the fall, had a very good series of meetings, and really started to establish some good relations, in my view, with Chinese counterparts. Unfortunately, he left a couple of weeks after that trip. He left the administration under a cloud of allegations of insider trading for stock. So not addressing that aspect of his departure, but just saying, if he were HHS secretary, I do wonder if those relationships that he had formed, personal bonds that he had formed in 2017, would have put things in a bit of a different light in terms of our initial response to the outbreak. In my view, the efforts to blame China by the Trump administration are really a distraction from the administration's own inability to prepare the United States. And so, unfortunately, the politics of blame is overtaking the potential of cooperation on areas like medical science and research. I think there's a range of different areas where you could see interaction between our two governments, from HHS or FDA on the kind of health side to things that I know are happening on the PPE side. There are flights of PPE equipment that colleagues from the State Department are working on to get from China to the United States. So some things are happening at the working level, but it's really not coordinated or orchestrated at all. And both sides don't see much incentive to cooperate with the other. So if you were a mid-level or senior US official or Chinese official, and you said, oh, hey, we could really do something with that other country, no one is incentivized to go up and do that, because within their own political system, they're going to say, no, we're not going to be dealing with China because they're doing bad things. They didn't prevent the virus. Or conversely, within the Chinese system, why should we do this with the Trump administration? They're only saying bad things about us. So I do think it's a lost opportunity.
Thanks. And there's a question here that directly follows on from an anonymous attendee. Did China actively mislead the WHO? I'm not sure whether you can definitively answer, but
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's something we all want to know. My own view is the truth is going to come out about the origins of the virus, about Chinese interaction. Yes, the Chinese government controls many parts of the narrative, but there's too much information that will get out. My own personal view is right now we have a lot more urgent needs than figuring out exactly when this virus happened. The AP have this quite a good story saying that for 6 days, Xi Jinping sat on information before telling the WHO. I have no reason to doubt that. Excellent bit of reporting. That said, I think the WHO, as are all international institutions, are really membership-led. That is, almost no international institution actually has authority to do anything without its members. And so the WHO relies on its members to do a lot of things. One of the things the WHO does is take people from the US CDC to work there. And so these are sovereign nations who deal with international organizations, but the international organizations can't mandate that something happen to a sovereign nation. And so there is a kind of power imbalance built in, which the United States built up on purpose. We did not want to have a supra government in New York or in Geneva that could tell the United States what to do. And so by design, these institutions have to work cooperatively. Now, did the WHO fail in its job? I think you could make that case, and I think the U.S. administration is trying to make that case. I guess my point would be, right now is probably not the time to do it. I think in 6 months, in 12 months, there'll be accurate time to assess, is the WHO working or not? I think in some areas, the WHO is falling woefully short. In other areas, I think it's set up on purpose so that sovereign nations are the ones that report to it, not the other way around.
thank you. Let's shift gears for a minute to the trade war, which is something you've also had a lot of experience with. And we have a question from Michael Eisenberg. Can you please address the dual prongs of China's global initiatives on 5G? One, mobile itself using 5G as part of a bait and switch offering to third world developing countries, along with electric power and water. And two, China's appetite to supplant the US as a global IT leader.
Wow, that's a deep series of questions. Yes, I guess I should first say I'm not a technical expert. I've dealt on the policy realm with different parts of US and Chinese technology. This is my own personal view. I have my personal doubts about how wonderful 5G is going to be. For those of us that are old enough, I remember when the Iridium satellite constellation was being launched. This was a constellation of satellites that you could use a satellite phone to call anywhere in the world, and they put up several dozen satellites. In the end, the technology didn't quite pan out. I'm not saying 5G is not going to work, but what I'm saying is the overpromise of what 5G will deliver. This is my own personal view. I'm not quite sure it's going to be transform the way we live our lives in quite the way that the industry is painting it. So this is, again, my own personal view. I wonder exactly how concerned we have to be about 5G deployment. That said, on the questions of what China is pushing or not pushing, I mean, I think as the question lays out, 5G is part of a broader offering of commercial and government-backed loans to countries to build up their infrastructure. And I think one thing that you can say about China over the last 25 years is Chinese companies have gotten quite good at building domestic infrastructure. And if I'm country X and I need to have roads and rail and telecommunications infrastructure, I think it's completely reasonable for them to purchase Chinese equipment, have Chinese engineers install it. I don't think we as the United States should take a holier than thou attitude of, oh, well, you shouldn't take this building or this railroad simply because it's a Chinese company. So I find that to be not a credible policy on the part of the United States. On the part of China, I think it's largely opportunistic. I mean, I think if you look at the way the Belt and Road Initiative kind of came out, it was an ideological slogan led by Xi Jinping, and now the bureaucracy is figuring out what parts of it can come to fruition. And I think there are different parts of it. Some of it will involve technology, and some of it won't. But I don't see it as a kind of grand design from the top down. I think Chinese policy in this area is a mix of top cover and kind of bottom up projects. In my own view, I think some of these projects are going to fail. The US had a lot of experience building things overseas. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think my own view is the US should have a little more confidence in our approach in how we view this and be less reactive on how it's going. I'm sorry, there was a second part to the question. I'm not sure that I answered it.
It was contrasting that with China's goal to supplant the US as a global IT leader.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think one thing that the central government has really focused on, really since the 1980s and 改革开放 reform and opening, has been the importance of manufacturing as the key engine of growth for Chinese employment and Chinese economic development. And I think the IT part of it is just part of that, right? That is not only is China becoming dominant in IT manufacturing, it's becoming dominant in many areas of manufacturing. And I think actually, if you look at what's worked, in some ways, industrial planning has failed. The sectors in which China has done well, it's done well in spite of the fact that that's not where state money has gone. State money has gone to places that largely have not done that well. Automotive sector, some areas of construction, but for aviation. But the sectors that have really taken off are the IT sectors, which are not state-owned in the same sort of way and have not benefited from subsidies. They've had to compete in different ways. The Chinese market is protected, so it's not exactly global competition. But Huawei didn't get ahead because they had a huge amount of money from the central government. They got ahead because they borrowed or stole or licensed technology, were able to manufacture it and deploy it, again, in a protected market of China, but in a way that was quite competitive. And if you look at the software side, Alibaba and Tencent, those companies didn't grow because they had subsidies. They grew because they were in a protected market, yes, but because they were incredibly competitive. And so I think in some ways and if you look at the growth of the PC market, this was not some huge design. It was because US and Japanese and European PC manufacturers located in China, and those then suppliers grew up and were able to become global. So, I think there's a lot of talk about concern over industrial policy and how China is going to take over these sectors. But actually, what's worked oftentimes is the marketplace, and that's what Chinese companies have excelled in, is sectors that are quite internationally competitive.
Thank you. That's a very, very interesting perspective that we don't hear a lot right now. Let's shift again, this one to the big picture from Professor Gary Tallarico. It seems clear that China's repressive political system is responsible for suppressing information about the coronavirus and has made this pandemic worse than it might have been. The political system isn't going to change, and the direction of more control, not less, is clear. What, however, should we or the world do to ensure either censure the Chinese for suppressing information that affects world health, or encourage the Chinese, at the very least, to allow its people to communicate public health concerns without fear? For example, should the WHO sponsor a conference on the pandemic that focuses on the origin and spread and single out China for criticism? China is sensitive about how they are perceived, and this seems a point of leverage.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think when using leverage, you have to figure out what the goal is, and that's certainly an option. I think my own view is on the broader picture of where Chinese control of information is yes, we are in a time of tightening up of information controls and society controls under Xi Jinping. I don't think just because the last 5 years have been increasingly tightening, that the next 5 years will only go in that one direction. I think what you've seen of Chinese policy for the last 25 years, and certainly since reform and opening, is a kind of modulation. Yes, I would agree right now the trend line is not good, but that doesn't mean that now and forever we're only going to go straight down. I think there are a number of different technological and public relations tools that can help open things up. I do think, though, we have to recognize our own limits. And talking to officials in the 1990s, in which we spent a lot of time talking about human rights with China, we just have to recognize our own limitations. There are some things that we are going to be able to put on the international agenda and put on the agenda with China, and there are some things that are not. I think one thing that we shouldn't do, and I think this administration made a mistake, is in playing tit for tat with Chinese journalists and visas in each other's countries. That is, the US administration, out of frustration that there is an asymmetry of access to technology platforms and access to media in the United States and China, in which the US has an open media environment, in which Chinese journalists can tweet and can get on US TV, and US officials don't have that same sort of access in China. What the Trump administration did was to limit the number of visas of state broadcasters and state media companies in the United States. The result was a number of journalists from US publications, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal among them, got kicked out of China. And that was completely predictable. And in the end, to the questioner's question, is the United States better off with fewer trained journalists in China or not? And my view would be no. I think we should have more journalists in China. And so I think this was a policy decision that in some ways made us feel good. We were highlighting this problem of Chinese state press and this imbalance in access to information. Absolutely, that's worth highlighting. But the result of that policy action was now we will know less about what's happening in China. And Chinese citizens and officials and healthcare professionals that might have spoken to the New York Times or the Washington Post in the past, now there are fewer journalists for them to communicate with. So I think overall, we as a world and we as Americans are worse off by using that tactic of a kind of one for one in addressing this information imbalance.
And do you think we should call China out in the WHO more than we have?
I think it's a question worth considering. I think in my view, the first order question is, what's the goal? Is the goal simply to highlight the fact that China is suppressing information? If so, in my view, the WHO is not the right place to do that. I think there are other venues. The Human Rights Council is one. I think also, having US officials have a better relationship with the press than this administration does would give us much better moral standing. I also think, frankly, countries know that China is suppressing information on a range of subjects, including on health. So I guess I would just ask, what's the goal? Is it simply to shine a spotlight on Chinese suppression of information? I think in some ways we've already done that. Is it to try to give new tools to Chinese citizens to communicate with their leaders or with the outside world? Well, then let's look at the technology toolkit and see what we can deploy. So rather than rush the WHO and decide this is what we want to do as a kind of process, I guess I would look and see what's the goal that you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Casting our minds back to January, it seems like a long time ago. In fact, not. The phase one agreement in the trade talks was all in the news. So I wonder if you could comment briefly, this question's from me, on where you see the trade talks going now in light of the last couple of months.
Yes, thanks. As I said, I was at the embassy in Beijing when we began our tariff escalation. That was the kind of foundational part of the trade war. I think where we are going at the end of this administration is we will be on pause and through November. I think there are few incentives on the part of the Trump administration to rip up the phase one trade deal. The Chinese side has no incentives to start the second phase of negotiations on the more difficult issues of subsidies and state enterprises and industrial policy. So I think you will see China following through with commitments on purchases, on some of the market access agreements. I think you will see a kind of slow march through those things. China just released its IPR, intellectual property rights plan. It was maybe a week or two late, but I think kind of understandable given the circumstances of the coronavirus. And so I think you will see kind of slow implementation, but there's no incentive, in my view, on either side to rip up where things are. I think from the Trump administration's point of view, they don't want to have more uncertainty in the stock market. And so they don't want to rip up this agreement. And from the Chinese point of view, they feel like they're not happy with the current level of tariffs, but they don't want tariffs to go up. And they don't want, there's enough challenges domestically and internationally. They don't want this to be another source of friction. And so, again, I think both sides have incentive to keep the status quo. And I doubt that there'll be phase two negotiations. If there are, I don't think they'll be very serious. I think the big question is what happens after the November election. What does either a second Trump administration do or a Joe Biden administration do with both the current tariffs and with broader trade policy and the World Trade Organization? That is, does the Biden administration decide to scrap unilateral tariffs, which are WTO inconsistent, and decide to go back to WTO rules and norms? Or do they decide they're going to keep some of these tariffs in place and that they're an important point of leverage and an important positioning for the United States? So again, I think between now and November, probably status quo. I think the question will be, in January of next year, what happens with U.S.-China trade?
All right. Another question here about the trade talks is from Connor O'Brien. Do you believe that the U.S. will ultimately believe that the plight of the Uyghurs is regrettable but not worth pursuing if it damages trade talks?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things that I wrote a note to myself is this administration has tried to, with its public messaging, before almost every single round of trade talks, has tried to put out some policy that they thought would rattle the Chinese side. So every time Vice Premier Liu He would come to Washington beforehand, the day before, 2 days before, or the day of, the administration would release some new sanctions on Huawei, or the administration would announce some new law enforcement action against Huawei or ZTE, or some new draft regulations on export controls. I think at the first time that you do that, the other side gets rattled. I think regarding the Uyghurs and its impact on trade talks, I think from the Chinese point of view, those things are separate lanes. And I don't think action in one leads to the other. There are a number of bills in Congress on kind of treatment of Uyghurs and exports of products from Xinjiang to the United States that might lead to increased tariffs. But I think broadly speaking, these two things kind of won't converge on trade. I do think there's an area of potential friction on, broadly speaking, new policies on Uyghurs and on exports from Xinjiang, on handling overall relations. But I don't see that as confined only to the trade talks. I think it has the ability to undermine and affect how we deal with China on a range of different things, including dealing with the pandemic. But at the moment, it's in its own lane.
All right. A question from Chi Xiang Ng. In the absence of track 1 diplomacy on the part of the US government, how strong are track 2 and track 3 diplomatic initiatives in promoting engagement?
Right. So track 1 being official government to government, track 2 being former government officials and academics. And sometimes track 1.5 is a mix of those two. That is, you'd have some government people and some former government or academics. I think it's important. I also think, frankly, subnational level meetings are important. That is, from the US side, states and provincial meetings on the Chinese side. The federal government certainly sets, in the US system, sets the overall chapeau of where things are. But I think there are other discussions that happen on the people-to-people side, and I would say track 2 discussions are part of that. I do think the Chinese side is a little bit hobbled with their system in that, I've been to a number of track 1.5 and track 2 discussions, and on the US side, we oftentimes have former secretaries of state, former cabinet officials, former ambassadors, former White House chiefs of staff, and on the Chinese side, they often have an academic from Tsinghua or someone from Kicker, they're one of their think tanks. And there's an imbalance there. That is, the US is dealing with former officials who had to make decisions and were then held to account. And on the Chinese side, they're academics and they're friends of mine and they're very smart, but it is a different level of conversation. And this is something that I think undercuts the quality of the track 2 discussions when the Chinese side has participants who are just not as experienced in actually making decisions on the part of their government. And I think in order for the track 2 discussions to really yield fruit, China should allow more former officials to participate and really say what they think. And I know that's not where their system is today, but I think if China wants to extend its soft power in a real way and have real discussions at a think tank level, they need to have more people speak who've actually been inside government and had to make decisions and then can speak freely.
Right. Okay, a question here from Professor Dan Markey at SAIS. James, what's your sense of China's capacity to exploit the aftermath of the pandemic as a means to advance global initiatives like BRI? On balance, do you anticipate China turning inward and pulling back, or would you expect it to, quote, double down on overseas activities? How much of Beijing's decision on such issues will be driven by purely economic constraints?
Thanks for the question, Professor Markey. I would say the discussion in Washington now is mask diplomacy is not going to work that well. That is, the Chinese effort to win friends and influence other countries by sending plane loads of medical supplies and medical staff. Countries will see through that, and China's not going to reap much of a benefit. I think the jury is still out. I think if the Chinese government can fine-tune its approach to how it deals with other countries and sends medical technology and interacts with the global economy, I do think this can be a moment that the Chinese government could be seen as a reliable global partner, something that the US is not seen as at the moment. I think there are, as Dan mentions in his question, these serious sustainability questions about China's overseas ambitions when there's clearly a large need at home for rebuilding the domestic economy as the Chinese economy gets back to work. I think I'm going to use a cop-out term of it's too soon to tell kind of where things are. I think the trend lines are not good, and the Chinese officials oftentimes play to the home audience to the detriment of foreign countries in which China wants to be seen and Chinese officials want to be seen as raising the flag, and that's good for them at home and with the foreign ministry, but it sometimes irks the host country that's getting this equipment. And I'd say right now that trend line will continue, and that's probably not going to be good for China. That said, if you looked at the last BRI summit in Beijing, China was able, under Xi Jinping's leadership, to change some aspects of the way it was dealing with other countries and take, say, environmental concerns into account. And so you can see some modulation in Chinese policy. I don't see it today, but it's possible in the next 3 or 4 months that that will happen. I think to the earlier questioner's point, how China deals with the WHO, how heavy-handed it is with other countries in the region and in the world will be part of how it's judged in this aftermath of the pandemic.
Right. We have about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to turn to some questions about the presidential elections. I think we're all thinking about how our China policy is going to be affected in the run-up to the election. And I have a question from an anonymous attendee. To what extent will the presidential election affect U.S. foreign policy towards China in the next decade? For instance, if Joe Biden gets elected, will Taiwan become the priority given PRC government has shown strong attitudes toward the current Taiwan administration?
Well, I think what will change under a Joe Biden administration is both the approach to the international system and existing institutions and to then how China fits into that. And so I had mentioned kind of earlier the Biden administration looking at the WTO and what are US obligations and how much will we adhere to WTO rules and norms and how much will we allow the organization to function or not. I think in some ways you might see a Biden administration toughening up on China. That is, putting in place specific pieces of legislation on investment restrictions and export controls that this administration has been kind of episodic on. The Biden administration will also do a much better job of coordinating with US allies in the region, in this case, Korea and Japan, Australia, not an ally, but a security partner, Vietnam. Will a Biden administration rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example? Will it restart trade negotiations with Europe? All things that would, I think, concern leadership in Beijing. So I think that is likely. I think for a second Trump administration, you would continue to see mixed messages. At a very senior level, President Trump himself prizes his relationship with Xi Jinping. And so in some ways, that's a ballast, a leader-to-leader kind of understanding. On the other hand, there's been a fair amount of fluctuation up and down on, is China to blame for the coronavirus? Is China to blame for the trade deficit? And then how do we need to address it? So I think what you will get is, at the leader level, some consistency, but in a lot of other policies, a fair amount of fluctuation up and down. As I tried to kind of conclude before, I do think we are entering into a period that will be more challenging for the next decade in US-China relations, in which even areas of convergence will be problematic to work on. But my own view is we have to spend some effort to try to do that in our own interest.
Thanks. This looks like it'll have to be our last question. And again, this seems like a good closing question, again from someone anonymous. Can you please address how you think the idea of building a new type of great power relations, 新型大国关系, between China and the US is going to work?
Right. This was a Chinese formulation. The Chinese approach to many parts of foreign policy is, particularly with the United States, is first get the bumper sticker or get the banner headline and then fill it in. I think the US approach, broadly speaking, to dealing with China is work from the bottom up, figure what areas are of convergence, what areas are that we need to work on together, and then out of that will naturally come a strategic understanding at the leader level. I think that the Daguoguanxi formulation came out towards the end of the Obama administration, in which the Chinese side was looking for what's the right framework. We don't want to be caught in this Thucydides trap of a rising power and a existing power. So let's use this new formulation. My own view is I don't think that's particularly a helpful way to think about where things are in US-China relations. Again, I know on the Chinese side, it helps them conceive of how to move forward. I do think we are looking at a world with global institutions that are under severe stress. And so the question, in my view, for the United States and for China is, what role do you want these global institutions to play to address these global or domestic problems? And right now, I would say both countries have a very mixed view on their participation in these global institutions and their use of them. On the one hand, we want global institutions to do some things. On the other hand, we're finding global institutions aren't meeting our needs. And so that's the stress points that I see for the next decade, is not the formulation of new sort of great power relations, but is what's the relationship of these great powers to these global institutions.
Thank you so much. I feel like this last hour we've been able to zoom in and out from current crisis to long-term issues and many perspectives from previous administrations on U.S.-China relations. And it's something that we're all really fascinated by right now, where the focus is on today, today, today. So to you, James, from all of the audience, we really thank you for coming into this morning, getting up so early, and talking to us about your perspective on China.
Thanks for hosting. Great to be back in the SAIS family. Arrivederci for my friends in Bologna, and one on for my friends in Nanjing.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.